two really legitimate charges. He can't really quite make sense of all of this, but Agrippa is going to come visit. And so he seizes the opportunity to use Agrippa's insight into Jewish practices to try to get a handle on what's going on. In Acts 25, verse 13, when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. The Herod family tree is messy. Okay? If you've ever looked at the family tree of the family of Herod the Great, it's just awful. But an abbreviated Herodian family tree can perhaps give us some perspective as to the relationships of these various individuals. Herod the Great had a number of children, but we're going to only focus in this case upon one of them, Aristobulus. Aristobulus has two sons, one of whom is Herod, who becomes king of Chalcis, and the other is Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I, focusing upon the narration that we're looking at, has three children who play into the narrative in this connection. One is Agrippa II, the second is a daughter, Bernice, and the third child is Drusilla, who was Felix's wife. Again, this whole thing becomes rather messy, and we're not going to go into the details. Herod Agrippa was king whenever the fall of Jerusalem occurred, and he issued a coin in 74-75 that depicted Titus on the front and Nike victory on the back. And the sad part about this is that this coin is issued after Jerusalem was destroyed. Herod Agrippa has affinities. I mean, he understands the Jews to a large extent, but he's aligned with the Romans. I don't know how much of that is affection or if it's just sort of survival in a political scene. But nonetheless, you can see that there's a problem that arises. But another interesting thing that has been found, I don't know the date of this discovery, but in the modern town of Beirut, in the National Museum, there's an inscription that has been found, and it talks about Bernice and Agrippa. And this is a photograph of that inscription, courtesy of the Beirut National Museum. And the full inscription, this is only a part of it, the full inscription reads, "The great King Agrippa, Philo Caesar," which is basically a lover of Caesar, "and Queen Bernice, children of the great King Agrippa, restored in the colonia of Julia Augusta Felix Berytus from their own money this bathhouse." I'm not sure if that's necessarily what the structure is, which their ancestor, King Herod, had built and which had fallen to ruins, and re-erected the marble statues and these 6 columns. And so you have an inscription outside of the Bible and outside of literature that refers to this association of Agrippa II and Bernice. And the Bible narrates, on the next day, when Agrippa came together with Bernice amid great pomp and entered the auditorium, accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Now, as one visits the site of Caesarea Maritima, which is the political administrative center for Palestine, the Roman procurators and rulers governed from that point. And you have to remember that this is a town that was established and built by Herod the Great. And he has this really fancy palace that is there, the Praetorium that we talked about several episodes ago. And this is the plan of that palace. Now, this is the right-hand side is sort of the public area. The left-hand side that protrudes into the ocean is the private quarter. But in this, there's the room number 5 that you see. That's the room of the hearing. And as you go there, you can see where almost certainly Paul is going to have his hearing before Bernice and Agrippa. It's a rather moving experience to stand there and realize the probability, indeed almost certainty, that this is where Paul stood as he delivers this speech to King Agrippa. Now, he claims, of course, that because of Jesus' death and resurrection and the proclamation to the Gentiles, that this was all prophesied by Moses and the prophets. And Paul then appeals to Agrippa. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. Agrippa replied to Paul, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. It's not clear whether he's asking a question or is making a statement. We'll leave that alone. And Paul said, I wish to God that whether in a short or long time, not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am, except for these chains. Of course, Paul is referring to becoming a Christian. And again, the courage that Paul exhibits in making this declaration before this very, very influential individual and Bernice. But he does not allow the authority of their figure or their position to deter him in doing what he knows he needs to do as a child of God.
Very interesting video. We'll look at some of that history a little bit too, a little bit more as we dig into that a little bit. That video, thinking about Caesarea Maritima, seeing the ruins there, and as Dr. Manor describes, of pretty confident that's where Paul would have stood, as we're going to read about today, is pretty incredible as we see those historical sites. I know we had planned there's a lot of trips to Israel, but there was a trip I had a deposit down to go in June. Caesarea Maritima is one of the places we were going to travel to, and of course it's been canceled because of the problems in Israel right now. So all those trips are pretty much canceled. But I think it'd be incredible to actually visit those sites, and especially when we've been through this study and see and just the background there. So we'll see how that goes. Lord willing, maybe we'll be able to do that someday and see that. But I appreciate his insight. And actually, Dr. Manor was going to be one of the leaders on that trip as well. And he does that on a regular basis. But as we look at that, we see those sites really exist. These people are true figures of history. And so it really brings credibility to what we're studying. So I'll kind of give us a little background. Of course, since we've been out of class for a couple of weeks. Remember, Paul has been in prison in Caesarea Maritima for 2 years. Felix was the governor, and now Festus is the governor. Remember, the last time we visited, we talked about how Festus had gone first to Jerusalem to discuss to the Jews what they wanted him to do as the new governor. And the first thing they bring up is, you've got this prisoner, and we want you to try him. And basically, he's going to tell us today that he knew they wanted him put to death. And that's Paul. He's been there for 2 years. And so the new governor comes in and has to decide what to do with him. And so that's where we find Paul. As far as our time frame goes, we're about in 58 to 60 AD. Festus becomes the procurator, which is the governor, about 60. So probably in our time frame now, we're about 60 AD. And Paul is still in Caesarea Maritima, which is here. This is going to be our map when Paul starts taking his voyage to Rome, which is going to occur in the next chapter or so. But here's where Paul is. Remember, they brought him from Jerusalem to protect him, brought him to Caesarea Maritima, which is basically where the Romans headquarters are for the centurions. And so that's where Paul has been kept in prison for 2 years. And so that's where we are today as we look at this. As Festus now, the new governor, is going to have to decide what to do with Paul. So let's tie on to what Dr. Manor said to us a little bit about King Agrippa, his background a little bit in this first verse of Acts 25, verse 13. Now, when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. Okay, Festus is the new governor, and he's the new governor there. He's at Caesarea Maritima. Agrippa and Bernice arrive to greet the new governor. And so we're going to see from the instance of that, as we look further, that this is an opportunity for Festus to get some input from King Agrippa. But anything from Dr. Manor's discussion on Herod's lineage, any of that Anything strike you from what he said? I've got a slide here we'll look at. We've talked about his lineage before. And like Dr. Manner said, it's very diluted, it's very complicated from the marriages of brothers and sisters. And as a matter of fact, Agrippa is married to his sister. Bernice is his sister. So it gets pretty diluted. Let's go back here for a second. But just to make this, Herod Agrippa the first was the Herod of Acts chapter 2, okay, which was the Agrippa we're looking at now. I might as well go ahead and look at this. This was, in Acts chapter 2, this is Herod Agrippa the first, and he's just known as Herod, and we talked about the different Herods. Herod the Great was the one who built all these things. He was the Herod who had the most prestige. He's the Herod who killed all the babies at the birth of Jesus. And so the Herod that's talked about in Acts 2:12 is Herod's son. And then we're going to see that Herod Agrippa the second that we're looking at today is his grandson. So it's all in that lineage. But here's what King Agrippa's father did. This is King Agrippa's father, okay, in Acts chapter 2. He puts James to death, and this is back in Acts 12 when we studied that. Now, about that time, Herod the king had laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now, it was during the days of unleavened bread. When he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church of God, church to God. Do you remember what happened in that instance with Peter? What happened, John? He miraculously released, wasn't he? And remember, that's when the church is praying and he knocks on the door and they don't believe it's Peter. Remember we talked about that. And then they tell Peter leaves town because it's not safe for him there, because Herod is going to continue to look for him. And in verse 19, if you look at Acts 12:19, those soldiers says they're executed. They couldn't explain what happened. And so they search for Peter, obviously around Jerusalem, and Peter is left. So we see that instance there. This is some background. This is King Agrippa's father who's done that. At the time this occurred, most scholars think that King Agrippa was probably about 17 years old. We know that from history that Herod, that's referred to in Acts 12, died in like AD 44. And we have the instance of his death recorded in Acts chapter 12. And so at that time, Agrippa, who was about 17, wasn't given all the power that his father had. He was just given a little stake here. And so his power would never be to the level of his father. And so, but he was highly regarded by the Jews because he had Jewish blood. And that goes back to this lineage because his great-grandfather had been married to a Jew. And anytime there was any connection of blood, in Jewish blood in your lineage, you were considered a Jew. So King Agrippa had Jewish bloodline, so that gave him more credibility with the Jews. So the new governor, what does he expect that Agrippa can help him with? Being connection with the Jews, you think that could be helpful? Because it's the Jews that Festus is trying to what? Trying to appease, trying to satisfy. So King Agrippa comes to town, and he's got some credibility among the Jewish people. So here's an opportunity for Festus to get some assistance. Now, the thing that was a real scandal in that time was, here's the lineage of those that we have contact with. Herod the Great, again, Matthew chapter 2. And you can see here, Herod Agrippa the first. He was known as Agrippa the first. Acts just says that he's Herod, and that gets confusing until you look at the lineage. So Herod Agrippa the first is the father to Herod Agrippa the second. Here is Agrippa that we're looking at, King Agrippa. He's married to his sister. Bernice is his sister. That's part of the scandal that was there. It was an open thing that she was his sister. And that reference, that Greek reference that Dr. Manor referred to, it refers to Queen Bernice. So she's even given the designation of queen. And it said, if you read the history, that it was scandalous among the Jews and the Gentiles, but it was just part of what was going on. So that was their relationship. She actually left him. You can read the history. It's really a sordid history. She leaves her brother at one point because the word of the incest, rumors of incest were so rampant. She leaves him to try to quell those rumors, but she doesn't stay away very long. It's only about a year, and she comes back, and she stays with him until after the destruction of Jerusalem. They go back to Rome, and there's other things that happen. But it's a crazy story. It's almost like a soap opera, but it's history. So we bring it up because it gives us the nature and the character of the individuals that Paul's in front of here. And as I study this, I wonder, King Agrippa was 17 when his father is persecuting the Christians. And most scholars write about, Agrippa has some understanding of Christians and their beliefs. He'll particularly probably know about Paul as the king of the Jews, poor Agrippa. He would know about this renegade Jew, Paul, and probably gives rise to why he wants to hear from Paul, as we'll see here in the text. Thoughts or comments about that? It's probably more history than you want to know, but I kind of enjoy the history part of it because to me it adds so much to these people we're dealing with. This is real. This is real stuff. It's not just stories we read about. It's real history, and I think that helps us. So Drusilla. Here's another thing that's interesting. Drusilla, who is the brother of King Agrippa, is the wife of Felix, who was the former governor. So think about that. When Festus is talking about Felix, be careful about what you say because you're talking about the king's brother-in-law. So does that get more diluted? So he's not gonna be probably as critical that Felix should have took care of this before he ever left. Probably if he said what he really wanted to say is, he left this mess. He should have handled this deal with Paul before he left, and I'm having to deal with this. The first thing he has to deal with when he gets there, the Jews are upset about it, and he's got to deal with it, but he's not going to say that to King Agrippa because that's his brother-in-law. So you see how diluted it gets, and it may help us understand maybe some of the way things are said and the way things are done, because it's just so convoluted in all these family connections and the power of the Herods. Now, King Agrippa is probably the last of the Herods. They say that the dynasty of Herods is going to end with King Agrippa. This is the last of the power of the Herods who have had power ever since the early before Christ. So, okay. Thoughts or comments before we move on to the rest of the text? Okay, so that's laying some groundwork. Like I said, probably more groundwork than you wanted, but here we go with the rest of the text. So here's the people that's involved. So while they were spending many days there, so here we come. King Agrippa and his wife, his sister Bernice, come to Caesarea Maritima. They're staying there for several days, and so they've got to be entertained by Festus. I mean, he's got dignitaries there, so he's got to entertain them. So while they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there was a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. Okay. So what do you see Festus is doing there? Okay. Trying to get out and do anything? Anything else come to mind? Why he wants King Agrippa involved? Because what has Paul done? What did Paul do? Remember the last time we were together and that Festus wants to take Paul back to Jerusalem? And what does Paul do to keep that from happening? He appeals to Caesar. Okay. So remember, Paul's appealed to Caesar. Now, when you send somebody to Caesar, you need to write up, why are you sending him to me? What's this man done? You know, you don't want to be frivolous sending somebody to Caesar that you can't take care of. Now, that wouldn't look good, would it? So here you've got this governor going, he's appealed to Caesar, and they wanted condemnation. I don't see anything he's done. And he's going to want King Agrippa to kind of, will you help me here? And he's going to talk about these letters that he needs to write to the emperor as he sends him. So he's asking for some help, isn't he? Do you notice anything he says there? One thing he makes mention of, as he responds, of course, he's not real critical of Felix, is he? He just says, a prisoner that Felix left here, we'd already heard that he wasn't real happy about what Felix had done, but he doesn't really express that to the king, and we see why. But he said, I answered them that the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. He's saying, and I know we don't do that without them having to meet their accusers face to face, but what has he missed here with Paul? He's already met his accusers face to face once before. When Felix was the governor, remember, even the high priest, who was Ananias at the time, remember, he comes from Jerusalem with some other of the Sanhedrin. They traveled to Caesarea Maritima. Remember, they bring their attorney. Remember, we talked about their attorney. They bring an attorney who's more well-versed on Roman law. They bring an attorney with them to speak on their behalf. Paul has faced his accusers before. So Paul should have been released. He should have been released, shouldn't he, John? They still had nothing against him. So he has already effaced his accusers. But now, what's going to happen?
Disagree.
Yeah, they disagree. Well, he had faced them, but they haven't got the results that they wanted. And the governor, as we saw in our text last week, is trying to appease the Jewish people and basically the leaders of the Jews more than anything else. Here in Acts 24, verse 1, here's where Paul had appealed before his accusers before the other governor, Felix. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders, with an attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. And if you read that text and review that text again, Paul spoke in front of them. So he had this opportunity in front of his accusers. So now they've just kept him in prison, and now the new governor's there. The previous governor should have released him, but now we're going to have to deal. Felix is going to have to deal with the problem. He didn't really know what to tell the emperor, so he's going to get King Agrippa to try to help out. So, thoughts or comments on that? Kind of see the dynamics there, Paul.
You know, they kind of looks like they're afraid to step up, say, I did it. Let's pass the buck to somebody else. Take the heat off of them.
Yeah, exactly. And you got this. He's a new governor, and he's supposed to keep the peace in Palestine. And he wants to appease the Jews if he can. But since Paul has appealed to Caesar, Paul's going to go to Caesar. So now he's got this other issue. I need to let Caesar know, what he's accused of, what he's done. So we're going to more of the text now. Verse 17 of chapter 25. So after they had assembled here, Festus is still talking to King Agrippa, explaining to him what happened. So he said, after they assembled here, that's the leaders who had come to see Festus. I did not delay, but on the next day I took my seat at the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. Okay, he's already had his hearing. You just said he hadn't been able to, you have to present yourself before your enemies. He's just stating he had done that again when Festus first got there. When the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting. But they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar." Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I also would like to hear the man myself." "Tomorrow," he said, "you shall hear him." So, anything else come to your mind from what Festus is saying to King Agrippa?
Still looking for God.
Yeah, still looking for cover. Yeah, he's definitely still looking for cover. But he mentions if he was willing to go to Jerusalem. Now, we talked about that in the other portion when he mentions to Paul about going to Jerusalem. Are you willing to go to Jerusalem? A lot of scholars think that previously Paul wasn't going to have a choice. He had decided to take him back to Jerusalem, and he goes on to say he did this on behalf of the Jews. So here he's making the point, probably a little not quite as stern a point to where Paul was going to go back to Jerusalem. That's where he had decided to take him. And he knew that wouldn't be safe for him to go there. So Paul appeals to Caesar. Mike? Uh-huh. He could ask for a lawyer, but we talked about before, you'd have to pay for that. It's expense. You would have an expense in that, and that was not a cheap thing to do. No, yeah, exactly. There's no court-appointed lawyer. You'd have to be able to be wealthy enough to afford an attorney on your own during that day and time. I think Paul had the confidence that what Jesus has told him, that he had told him that he would go before him, he would be with him. And I think Paul, and Jesus told him, it had been prophesied, I'll tell you what to say. I'm going to be with you. And I think Paul took that to heart. And I think we see that time and time again. It's a good question, though. Steve?
What is this like?
Yeah, somewhere around that. You raised a really good point. Most scholars think that Festus is not familiar with who it is, but King Agrippa does. He's aware of Christians and what they teach because he's connected with the Jews. And so he's kind of more familiar with, and he probably even knows Paul's background, as a renegade Jew, and that's how they regard Paul. He's a renegade Jew. And so, uh, Agrippa probably is familiar with Paul. He knows a little bit about Christianity. But yeah, Festus doesn't. He's just a Roman who's been sent to Palestine. He has no regard for Christianity and what's going on. And that's a great point. And that's why he makes that mention. He doesn't have a clue who this man Jesus is, is what most scholars believe. Randy? Yeah. Yeah, and I think it is, and we're going to see here, and True for Today particularly makes a mention of why this is kind of a convenient thing for Festus that King Agrippa is there, because not only he has to provide entertainment for these dignitaries who are there, so now he's got something else for them to do on another day. We're going to have this hearing for Paul, and the other thing that it helps him is, like you just said, it kind of lets him say that, hey, I've got a witness now that I've tried to do justice in this case. So now he's got the king who's going to hear this from Festus that I tried to do everything I can to give this man justice, is basically, I think, what he's saying. And now King Agrippa's there who can validate that with any dignitaries, that the king's actually been there and heard this, and he knows I've tried to give him justice. Yes, sir. No, they're not. Yeah, no, unless Rome has granted him citizenship, he's a Jew. Okay. Herod's a Jew. Now, Herod the Great was not a Roman. He was also, his lineage is pretty diluted. Okay. He's not a pure Roman either. He had some Jewish lineage, but he's considered a Jew. So that lineage, he had some, he was, well, that might need to study that a little bit more. He had Roman background, and then he marries a Jewish woman. So there's some difference of opinion about his whole lineage, so about Herod. But as it passed down, there was there definitely has some Roman connections there, because King Agrippa had he had Jewish heritage, because Agrippa, or Herod the Great, had married a Jewish woman, but he'd had five wives or so. So that's a good question you raise. I'm not totally sure about the. Well, that's a good question. Now, Festus doesn't bring it up, but he only had the right to appeal to Caesar because he was a Roman citizen. So that's the only reason Festus could even let him appeal to Caesar or Agrippa. Okay. Felix, you said Festus is considering King Agrippa as just a, right? Okay, yeah. King Agrippa is not a Roman citizen, right? Yeah, he is a Jew. Yeah, and he's basically King Agrippa. He's considered the king of the Jews in Palestine. That's his authority. He's taken some of the reign from his great grandfather, but he's given a small portion of that. He didn't have the power his great grandfather had, but yeah, he's going to be considered a Jew. Now, I hesitated because Roman could grant Roman citizenship to those in leadership. Now, I don't know if they ever granted Roman citizenship to any of these other kings of other parts of the nations or not, but they had the authority. They could grant citizenship if they wanted to. But that's a good question you raised. I don't think, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I'd have to look at that a little bit more here. Anybody got thoughts on that? Jerry? Who?
But we're in the leadership. Agrippa and Festus and all these guys.
They were not liked by who, are you saying? Well, the Jews didn't like any Roman authority. Now, they liked Agrippa, King Agrippa, because he was a Jew. Now, they didn't like any Roman authorities. I mean, he was granted authority by Rome, but he was a Jew. And that's why Festus leans to him, because he's going to have more credibility with the Jews. Jerry, do you have a comment? I'm sorry, John. Yeah. Well, he wants to go see the new governor. You're talking about King Agrippa. Yeah, he's going to want to see the new governor. And here's the other thing that makes this interesting. They are going, and I didn't bring this up earlier. Let me mention this and come back to your point, Jerry. Here's an interesting prophecy that we hear that Jesus says in Matthew 10, as he prophesies to his disciples, his apostles, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, to be shrewd as serpents, innocent as doves. But beware of men, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues. And you will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles." Jesus had prophesied that they're going to testify in front of kings, didn't he? And governors. And we've seen that unfold through the book of Acts. But back to your question. Now, here's another interesting thing about history. Think about this. Okay, King Agrippa's great-grandfather, Herod the Great, built the palace where they're at now, and the stuff that Dr. Manner showed us, where he showed that Paul would have had this hearing, that place was marble. It must have been a fabulous place. Herod the Great had built that. So that's where King Agrippa's grandfather the other Herod had ruled, and that's where the King Agrippa and his wife, sister Bernice, were raised. So think about this. They're back, they've come home. So they had a little connection to this place, didn't they? That's where they were raised. And it makes you wonder back during that time what they had heard about Christianity during the time of their father, who had put to death James and tried to kill Peter. But they were raised there. So this is kind of a homecoming for them. And they had come to see the new governor, but it's kind of like a homecoming. So you can imagine what they think is there in this facility, don't you? They used to rule that place. I mean, that's where they were raised up. So kind of interesting context there. But great questions. I sure don't know all the answers, but it's sure great to study and think about these things. Dean? Sanhedrin had a lot of power over the Jews. They still had power. Rome granted them that power, so they were still, Rome was the authority, but they granted the Sanhedrin a lot of authority because they wanted to appease the Jewish people, to keep the peace. Yes. Yes. Well, some of the Sanhedrin definitely were against Paul. Remember, the high priest is the leader of the Sanhedrin, and remember, in the first arrest, it's the Sanhedrin's high priest that comes to testify against Paul. He's the one that brings the lawyer there. So yeah, definitely the authorities of the Jews are against Paul. He is considered a renegade Jew. Remember, he was commissioned by the Sanhedrin to go out and to arrest these Christians. That was, 30 some years ago, Steve. But, no doubt Agrippa knows his history. I mean, that would be something you would know, being a Jew and this man who's a renegade Jew and what's going on. So I think that really comes into play with why Agrippa says, I want to hear from him tomorrow. So great questions and thoughts. Any other thoughts or comments as we look at this? So we'll get into the next day, and I just shared this one passage. Let's think about this for a minute. Try to picture this in our minds. So on the next day, the next day this hearing is going to come back, the pomp and circumstance is going to happen the next day. When Agrippa came together with Bernice in a great pomp, which has the idea of this show of display, great pageantry, and entered the auditorium accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city at the command of Festus, and Paul was brought in. So if you read some background there, maybe commentaries that talk about this must have been quite some spectacle. They're going to come in their kingly and queenly garb, sparkly and all luxurious. They're going to come into pomp and circumstance, almost like we might call it a little parade. They're going to come into all this pomp and circumstance, and it's going to be a big show on their part. And then what happens? They bring in this shabby little Jew, probably torn clothing, in shackles, and dirty, and beaten. You can only imagine. You read writers that speculate of Paul's appearance. He's probably beaten. Probably not much to look at. And they bring this man in front of them. You look at the comparison of what's happened here. It's just an interesting visual to see. This is what takes place here in this fabulous marble hall. Steve? Well, later on, we're going to see that, but there's speculation here in Caesarea Maritima. They had different aspects of those cells. Now in Philippi, when the Philippian jailer, that was a hole in the ground. But here, Caesarea Maritima, their places where they held prisoners were a lot better standards than what we saw in Philippi. Where they're held down in the dungeon, basically there in shackles. And the inner dungeon is what we're told. The inner cell is what we're told in Philippi. It's a great question. Maritima doesn't seem to be quite that bad. As they would hold Roman citizens, they didn't treat Roman citizens as badly as they would a non-Roman citizen, even as prisoners in most cases, from what I've read. Great question. But the pomp and circumstance here, is pretty interesting if you think about the dramatic difference. They're going to do all this, and they come dragging in this beaten Jew. And he's requiring all this. And I think about that prophecy. Jesus says, you're going to speak before kings and governors. And Jesus told him, I'm going to be with you. And so he didn't need an attorney, did he, Mike? He had the best one. He had the best one. But you think about that. I mean, it's just a visual that comes to my mind, and that here he's in front of all these dignitaries, speaking on the behalf of Jesus, and he's going to be bold. He's going to be bold. We won't get into the text of his message until next week, but that's the people he's going to be speaking to. So let's see the end of our text today, verses 24 through 27. Festus said, King Agrippa and all you gentlemen, he's addressing the crowd, King Agrippa and all you gentlemen here present with us, you see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both at Jerusalem and here, loudly declaring that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death. And since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my Lord. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems absurd to me in sending a prisoner not to indicate also the charges against him. So there's the bottom line in it. I need your help to tell me, we're going to investigate you. I'm going to let you hear what's going on here. You help me. I need your help, King Agrippa, as we investigate this matter, so I know what to tell the emperor when I send him on to Rome, because I got to send a letter with him. And so you see Festus' situation. I need some help here. He's baffled. And he knows they wanted him put to death. He says they wanted him condemned, they wanted him to live no longer, and I found nothing worthy of death on him. So instead of releasing him, which he could have done, he had the authority to do that because of the Jews. He's going to appease them. He keeps Paul a prisoner. And of course, Paul's appealed to Caesar, so now he has to honor that as a Roman citizen. He'll honor that. So other thoughts or comments? Jerry? Exactly. He had not broken a Roman law. And that's what Festus says. He said, once I interviewed him, there was things that they were accused. It wasn't anything like what I thought it might be. It was about this man Jesus, is what Festus comes to the conclusion. It had nothing to do with Rome. And for his standpoint, it didn't. So he's at a loss to what to tell the emperor when he sends Paul. I'm sorry? Hadn't broken Jewish law either, has he? He has not. Great point. He's not broken any law at all. They just have a hatred for him and want to silence him is what they want to do, the Jews, for that standpoint. So great questions. And again, I don't know all those answers. Hopefully we've researched together, but the history of it is really interesting. Trying to get the picture of who he's dealing with and the situation, I think helps us to vividly understand the power of what's going on here, the fulfillment of prophecy that Jesus talks about, and the courage and boldness that Paul has. No doubt is a reflection of the power and boldness that he gets through Christ. So next week, we'll be, if you're reading along in Truth for Today, pages 424 to 447, be Acts chapter 26, verses 1 through 32. We'll get into Paul's defense before the king. It'd be really interesting as we study what Paul's going to say now. So thanks for all your good comments this morning.